In the flickering light of a torch, shadows stretched long against the cold stone walls of a medieval chamber. Imagine the silence, broken only by the faint crackle of fire and the muffled sound of breath held too tightly in the chest of a trembling young bride. She was no more than 16, wrapped in rough linen, her hair veiled, her eyes downcast. In that moment she was not merely a bride, not merely a daughter given in marriage. She was a vessel of purity to be measured, inspected, and judged. In the Dark Ages, the sanctity of a union was not sealed with vows alone, but with proof of untouched flesh. Tonight, her worth, her family's honor, even her life, might rest upon the crude hands of strangers who claimed the right to test her virginity. For us, in the modern world, the very idea feels cruel, barbaric, almost unbelievable. But in the centuries of medieval Europe, virginity was currency. It was a sign of morality, of obedience, of family pride. A virgin bride brought not only dignity to her husband's household, but also political leverage, wealth, and alliances. The absence of virginity could destroy reputations, unravel dynasties, or incite violence that spread far beyond the bridal bed. And so, in candlelit chambers and smoky halls, virginity was not left to trust. It was tested, and tested in ways that were often invasive, humiliating, and devastating. The practice did not look the same everywhere. In some regions, midwives, matrons, or local women of supposed experience were summoned to conduct examinations. These women would search for what was believed to be the proof of maidenhood. The hymen, described in church texts as a divine seal placed by God to guard a woman's chastity. If it was thought to be intact, the bride was pronounced pure. If not, suspicions were raised. But the body does not always obey the myths people assign to it. Even then, there were accounts of women accused falsely, condemned for losing their so-called seal through exercise, accidents, or natural differences of anatomy. Yet once the accusation was spoken, it was rarely silenced. And this was only the beginning. In some traditions, virginity was tested not before the marriage but on the wedding night itself. The consummation was expected to produce evidence, a stain of blood on the white sheets. That single mark of crimson was more than a bodily sign. It was a proclamation of honor, paraded before family, servants, even entire villages. Imagine the pressure of that moment. The hushed anticipation beyond the chamber door, relatives whispering, the weight of expectations pressing on the newlyweds. If the blood appeared, there was celebration. If it did not, suspicion spread like a fire. Some families kept the bedsheets, stained and displayed as permanent proof that their daughter had delivered purity as promised. Others went further, carrying the sheets through the streets like a banner of victory. But what if the blood did not come? What if the bride, though untouched, did not bleed? What if nerves, pain, or the awkwardness of two frightened young people meant the act itself failed to produce the expected evidence? The consequences could be catastrophic. The bride might be accused of fornication, her dowry withheld, her reputation forever tainted. In some cases, women were sent back to their families in disgrace, cast out like damaged goods. And in darker accounts, punishment could be even harsher. Public humiliation, beatings, or worse. Virginity was not only a private matter, it was deeply entangled with law and religion. The Church, which held immense power during the Dark Ages, declared that marriage was sacred, but only if entered with purity. Sermons spoke of the Virgin Mary as the ultimate model, a woman untouched by sin and flesh. Priests reinforced the idea that women's worth was bound to chastity, their bodies symbols of morality. Law codes, too, often reflected this belief, permitting annulment or punishment if a bride was found not to be a virgin. In essence, women's bodies became battlegrounds upon which families and communities measured honor, faith, and legitimacy. And yet, beneath the rigid rules and rituals, there was fear. Fear in the heart of every girl who grew up hearing whispered tales of brides rejected, of mothers weeping, of bloodied sheets displayed like relics of judgment. Fear in the families who knew that one slip of rumor could destroy everything they had built. And fear even in men who were told that their strength, their manhood, was proven by drawing blood from their wives. The night of consummation was not only a union, it was a test for both. Fail, and shame would follow. One of the most haunting accounts comes from medieval chronicles that describe a bride stripped and examined before witnesses, her body poked and prodded under the pretense of truth. The very act of testing became a violation before any marital bed was touched. These examinations were carried out with ritualistic seriousness, as though the women performing them were priests interpreting signs from God. But for the girl at the center, the experience must have been terrifying, her modesty torn away, her dignity traded for judgment. There were also cases where kings and nobles demanded proof before allowing a marriage to proceed. In such courts, virginity was political. A royal marriage was not just a union between two people, but between dynasties, kingdoms, and claims to land. A queen accused of impurity could be discredited, her children denied legitimacy, entire wars ignited by suspicion over whether blood stained the marriage sheets. The fate of nations, it seemed, could rest upon the most intimate parts of a woman's body. But not all blood was real. Desperation bred deception. Across Europe, women and their families turned to tricks, herbs, and even animal blood to create the illusion of virginity. Midwives whispered secrets to nervous brides: pierce your finger, use a vial of chicken's blood, stain the sheets before anyone sees. Some even claimed to restore the hymen with special concoctions, powders, or minor surgical procedures. Primitive forms of what we might now call hymen repair. These acts were dangerous, but for many they were the only shield against ruin. In this way, virginity became not only a moral test but also a theater, a performance stage to protect survival. The cruelty of these rituals was sharpened by the silence imposed on women. Few voices of the brides themselves survive in the records, for they were rarely allowed to speak. Instead, we hear the judgments of men, priests, jurists, chroniclers, who wrote of virginity as though it were a possession to be verified, a seal to be broken, a commodity to be traded. Yet between the lines in the rare scraps of testimony, we catch glimpses of pain. A medieval letter from a woman accused of impurity pleads that she was faithful, that she bled not on her wedding night but later, from fear and trembling. Another record tells of a girl who took her own life rather than face the shame of failed proof. These fragments remind us that behind the rituals lay human suffering, hidden in shadows. The story of virginity testing in the Dark Ages is not one of isolated cruelty, but of a society bound by fear, superstition, and control. It reveals how deeply power can embed itself into the most private corners of life, turning intimacy into spectacle, love into transaction, and bodies into evidence. And though the centuries have passed, echoes of these practices still linger in parts of the world today. Yet the Dark Ages held their own contradictions. While Europe enforced virginity with such ferocity, other cultures of the same era placed less weight on these rituals. In certain tribal communities, sexuality before marriage was tolerated or even celebrated, proving that what was treated as divine law in one place was mere custom in another. This contrast underscores that virginity testing was not an absolute truth, but a man-made construct designed to control, to mark ownership, to protect lineage. Still, for those who lived beneath its shadow, it was no less real. The young brides who trembled before matrons, the couples who faced a wedding night turned trial, the families who awaited bloodied sheets. They all moved within a world where one slip of the body could alter the course of destiny. The Dark Ages are remembered for their castles, their crusades, their plagues. But beneath those grand stories lies this quieter, darker truth, that countless women were forced to prove their purity in ways that stripped them of dignity, choice, and voice. And as the torches burned low in the chambers of stone, as the linen sheets were lifted into the dawn air, the question remained: was this truly proof of purity? Or merely the cruelty of a society desperate to control what it feared most, the hidden power of women's bodies? The story is not yet finished. To truly grasp how these rituals spread, how they were justified, and how they scarred generations, we must dig deeper into the world of medieval courts, peasant villages, and cloistered convents. For the Dark Ages held countless variations of these cruel practices, each more haunting than the last. And so the tale deepens, drawing us further into the shadowed chambers of medieval Europe where innocence and sin were divided by the thinnest of lines. Imagine the tension inside a peasant village on the morning after a wedding. The entire community might gather in expectation, whispering in anticipation of the revelation that would come with the lifting of a sheet. The bride and groom, exhausted and terrified, would emerge to either celebration or shame. Laughter and song if the crimson mark was found, murmurs of suspicion if it was not. The couple's union, private in every sense, was transformed into a public tribunal. The marital bed became an altar of judgment. The obsession with proof seeped into legal codes and canon law, embedding itself in the very structures of authority. By the 12th century, church courts across Europe were filled with cases of annulment and dispute, many hinging on the question of a bride's virginity. If a husband claimed his wife had not been pure, the marriage could be challenged, sometimes even dissolved. These trials often devolved into humiliating examinations, with women forced to prove their innocence through physical inspection. To the men of law, virginity was treated as evidence, and women's bodies as the courtroom where truth was to be found. In some cases, the bride was subjected to ordeal-like rituals, echoing the superstitions of the time. Just as a suspected witch might be thrown into water to see if she floated, so too a young woman could be judged by arbitrary tests of her purity. Chroniclers tell of wives made to walk barefoot on hot stones, their supposed chastity confirmed if they emerged unburned. Others speak of brides forced to swear oaths before sacred relics, their trembling voices interpreted as signs of guilt. These practices reveal a society desperately seeking certainty in a world of uncertainty, where famine, plague, and war left little else under human control. Purity then became a desperate anchor, an imagined order imposed upon chaos. The weight of this obsession fell most heavily on the powerless. A noble woman accused of impurity might find protection in her family's influence, but a poor village girl had little recourse. If her husband rejected her, she might be cast aside with no dowry, no home, no support. She might return in disgrace to her father's hut, or be left to beg at the edge of the marketplace, branded forever as damaged goods. In this sense, virginity testing was not merely a ritual but a weapon, a means of control that maintained hierarchies and punished those without power. The church did not invent these customs, but it sanctified them. Priests preached that virginity was the highest state of womanhood, a holy condition modeled by saints and martyrs. Tales of young women who resisted seduction, who died rather than surrender their purity, were told and retold in sermons and stained glass windows. Virgin martyrs like Agnes, Cecilia, and Lucy became icons, their stories reinforcing the belief that a woman's greatest virtue was her untouched body. Marriage itself was tolerated by the church, but celebrated only when entered in purity. These messages shaped the minds of generations, embedding shame and fear into the very fabric of daily life. And yet, behind closed doors, contradictions abounded. Husbands who demanded chastity from their wives often indulged freely in brothels, where the very concept of virginity was commodified. Prostitutes who could claim to be virgins, or who could simulate the bleeding of defloration, charged higher prices, feeding a market built on fantasy and hypocrisy. Records from medieval cities reveal that brothels sometimes trained young women to mimic the signs of maidenhood, catering to clients obsessed with conquering purity. The same society that punished brides for failing to bleed also paid for the illusion of innocence in the arms of strangers. This hypocrisy extended to the ruling classes as well. Kings and princes arranged marriages for political gain, demanding that their brides arrive as pure symbols of alliance. Yet many of these same men fathered children with mistresses, flaunted affairs, and used their power to seduce or force themselves upon women of lower rank. For noble brides, the pressure was unbearable. A princess accused of impurity could lose her crown, her future, even her life. Whole dynasties hung on the fragile veil of virginity, and the women at their center bore the crushing weight of expectation. We must also speak of the silent terror of the wedding night itself. Imagine a young girl, often barely past childhood, lying stiff on a bed of straw or linen. The husband beside her might be twice her age, a stranger chosen for political or economic reasons. She knew that her task was not to love or to feel pleasure, but to prove. The consummation was not her moment of intimacy, but of trial. Every sound, every movement, every breath carried the weight of her family's honor. And beyond the door, a crowd of relatives and servants might wait, ready to inspect the sheets. For her, the night was less a union than an ordeal, an initiation into womanhood by fire. The consequences of failure could be fatal. Historical records, though sparse, tell of women beaten to death, strangled, or even burned when accused of having lost their virginity before marriage. Though such punishments were extreme, they reveal the depth of violence that could be unleashed by suspicion. The accusation alone was often enough to destroy a life. Virginity was a cage from which there was little escape, and the key was held not by the women themselves but by fathers, husbands, priests, and judges. Yet even in the darkest times, resistance flickered. Women shared secrets of deception, passing down knowledge of herbs that could simulate bleeding, of tricks to fool the eye. Midwives, who lived on the margins of respectability, became guardians of this hidden knowledge, risking their lives to help brides survive the ordeal. These acts of quiet rebellion were dangerous, for if discovered, they could be punished as fraud or even witchcraft. But they offered a sliver of hope in a world where hope was scarce. Over time, as the centuries passed and Europe stumbled toward the Renaissance, ideas about virginity shifted, but did not vanish. Science began to challenge superstition, Yet the myths of the hymen and the blood-stained sheet lingered stubbornly. The obsession with proof remained, adapted to new contexts, justified by new authorities. Virginity, it seemed, was a ghost that haunted generation after generation, refusing to die. And as we look back on the Dark Ages, the image that remains is not only of kings and castles, but of countless brides trembling in shadowed chambers, their fates balanced on the thin blade of expectation. The testing of virginity was not merely a custom. It was a system of control, a ritual of power, and a theater of cruelty that scarred the lives of women for centuries. But our journey into this darkness is not yet complete. To understand fully how these practices endured, how they were justified by Scripture, and how they shaped the fate of entire societies, we must descend further into the courts of kings, the sermons of priests, and the whispered stories of those who suffered in silence. And so we enter the courts of kings, where virginity was no longer just a matter of family honor but of dynastic survival. In royal marriages, purity was entwined with legitimacy, and legitimacy was the cornerstone of power. A queen who entered her marriage without proof of virginity risked not only her crown, but also the validity of her children's inheritance. Monarchs, nobles, and their advisors obsessed over this fragile condition as though it were a cornerstone of empire. When Anne of Brittany wed Charles VIII of France, chronicles obsessively recorded the consummation, the physical proof of union serving as a seal upon treaties and alliances. Similar anxieties ripple through royal histories across Europe, suggesting that behind the gilded thrones lay the same primitive fears as in the humblest of villages. The Church amplified this anxiety with sermons that painted female sexuality as a dangerous, corrupting force unless controlled by men. The Virgin Mary was upheld as the unattainable ideal, pure, untouched, divine, while ordinary women were judged against her impossible standard. This dichotomy set women in an eternal trial, condemned for failing to embody a purity that was never meant for mortals. Priests thundered from pulpits that virginity was a woman's shield, her ticket to heaven, her proof of worth. And when those words echoed in the ears of families desperate for respectability, the rituals of testing gained new authority. But history also remembers the cracks in this cruel edifice. Medical treatises began to circulate in the later Middle Ages, questioning whether the hymen could truly be relied upon as a marker of virginity. Physicians observed cases where women bled heavily, and others not at all, suggesting that the body's signs were far more ambiguous than the myths proclaimed. Yet even as knowledge expanded, culture clung to its symbols. The sheet, the blood, the examination. These endured, not because they revealed truth, but because they reinforced control. Imagine again the countless women caught in this system, their stories unrecorded. A peasant girl shamed and abandoned because her body did not conform to expectation. A noblewoman terrified that her family's political future rested upon whether she bled on command. A mother coaching her daughter to prick her finger and stain the linen, whispering that survival mattered more than honesty. Their voices are lost to us, drowned in centuries of silence. Yet their suffering forms the true history behind the chronicles of kings and priests. And what of the men? They too were bound by the weight of this obsession, though in different ways. A groom who failed to consummate his marriage might be ridiculed, declared impotent, or even face annulment. His manhood, like his bride's chastity, was on trial. The wedding night became not a moment of love, but of performance, a stage upon which both husband and wife were actors in a drama written long before their birth. Failure for either could mean humiliation, disgrace, or ruin. As the centuries turned and Europe marched toward modernity, the brutality of public sheet displays and forced examinations faded, but the ghost of these practices lingered. Even today, in some corners of the world, virginity testing persists, a dark echo of the medieval chamber, alive in modern clinics and rituals. The persistence of this belief reveals how deeply rooted it is in human fears, the fear of betrayal, of dishonor, of losing control over lineage and legacy. It is a superstition disguised as science, a ritual cloaked in morality, a practice that has outlived its age. The Dark Ages teach us many lessons, but perhaps none as haunting as this, that a society can bind its women with invisible chains as surely as with iron. The virgin bride, trembling before matrons, priests, or a watching crowd, was more than a symbol of purity. She was a victim of a system that turned her body into evidence, her worth into proof, her most private self into public property. For centuries, the fate of women was balanced on a single night, a single sheet, a single drop of blood. In the end, What do these rituals tell us? They reveal the fragility of human certainty, the desperate lengths people go to control what they cannot understand. They expose the cruelty of reducing human worth to biology, the arrogance of declaring morality written in flesh, and they remind us that history's darkest practices are not always buried in the past. The echoes of the medieval bedchamber still whisper in our present, urging us to question the rituals we inherit, the myths we cling to, the power we grant to symbols that strip people of dignity. So as the torchlight fades on the stone walls of the Dark Ages, as the linen sheet is lowered and the whispers of judgment fall silent, we are left with a haunting truth. The testing of virgin brides was never about purity. It was about control, about power, about fear. And though centuries separate us from those chambers, the lesson remains urgent, that a society's obsession with purity often reveals not its morality, but its cruelty. This is the legacy of the Dark Ages virginity trials, a theater of pain masquerading as tradition, a ritual of fear that scarred generations. And in remembering it, we shine a light not only on the past, but on the shadows that still linger today.